Again, this morning we're beginning a new study, and it's based on a book by Mark Atterbury called Wilderness Walking, and it's walking with God on the road you never wanted to travel. Walking with God on the road you never wanted to travel. And it uses the experiences of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years as a metaphor for us. And so I want us to just think about what brought Israel to the place that they found themselves for a little bit. You know, as Israel grew in Egypt, they experienced great favor for a time, right? As long as Joseph was there. But apparently they knew that was not going to be their long-term home. How do I know that? Well, one of my favorite passages in Scripture is in the end of Genesis where Joseph is about to die. And in chapter 50, verse 24, Joseph says to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Joseph knew that they were going to a promised land, and there was no doubt because he said in the following verse, "When you go, take my bones with you. Don't leave them here in this land." You know, that's just amazing to me. I'm not too worried about what happens to my remains down the road. Matter of fact, Risa gets aggravated with me because I'll tell her just to prop me up on a good oak tree with the mountain view and say bye. And she said, "You know I can't do that." But here Joseph knew that there was a promised land coming, and he yearned from it or for it so much that he wanted them to take his remains to that land. So Israel had known for a long time that there was a promised land coming. But it was pretty far off at this point. Matter of fact, it would be over 400 years until they left Egypt. And God did some amazing things, didn't he, to convince Pharaoh to let them go. And so they're on their journey. They're full of joy, headed toward that promised land. And they run into some obstacles. And the first one is the Red Sea was in their way, and there was an Egyptian army coming, right? And what did God do? He not only gave them a path through on dry land, but he also destroyed the Egyptian army and drowned them in the Red Sea. That's a great and powerful exhibition of what God can do and will do for his people, isn't it? Amazing. But then it wasn't any time before they were thirsty and hungry and grumbling and complaining again. And we see that continue over time. Until the point in time they have a lot of grumbling, complaining, and issues, and we know about them having Isaac make a golden calf for them and the results of that. So it was a troubled journey along the way, even though God was leading them by a cloud during the day and by a fire at night, was always with them. His presence was there. But they get to the promised land and they send spies out, right? And there were 12 spies. 10 said what? "We can't do this. They've got giants over there." And, I like that they said, well, this is a land flowing with milk and honey that God's prepared for us. The amazing thing to me is they would be coming into this land with all the crops ready to harvest. They didn't even have to do the work on preparing for how they were going to eat the next day and the next and the next after they took over this land, because God had the land ready for them when they got there. And they acknowledged that. But they couldn't see, or at least some of them couldn't see past the giants to what God had led them to. And they gave a bad report. And we're going to pick up on that bad report here in just a minute. If you want to turn to Numbers chapter 14, we'll be there a good part of the day. But they get to that point, and God says, because you have rejected me and have not obeyed me and trusted me, you're going to spend a day in the wilderness, or a year in the wilderness, for every day that the spies spied out the land. 40 years. So they had looked forward to this promised land coming. Because of their own disobedience, they didn't make it there. So what's the message for us out of this? How do we keep from getting derailed on our journey? You know, we have a promise that we're looking for, right? What's our promised land? It's her to look back, she said, I'm just unlucky at love. He said that was not the problem. She kept making the same mistake over and over and over again, and the results were the same results over and over again. And who was it that said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? And so we need to look back sometimes so that we can recognize our mistake and not continue to make it. And then the other reason we need to look back is that sometimes when we look back, we realize there's nothing we could have done to change this outcome. And it doesn't change the road that we're on sometimes, but it does remove a burden of guilt that sometimes we carry that makes the road harder. And so those are some of the reasons to look backwards. So let's look at some ways that folks wind up in the wilderness, and we'll do that by starting with Israel and their journey in the wilderness. Somebody, if you would, read Numbers 14, verses 1 through 4. Numbers 14, 1 through 4. All right. So we find here that the spies have given their bad report. Israel rebels against God and against Moses, and their solution is to go back to Egypt. What they failed to remember, and what we fail to remember sometimes, is that God had done for them what they couldn't do for themselves. God had done for them what they could not have done for themselves. If we could remember that in our Christian journey, which, by the way, is very true for us, God certainly did for us what we could never do for ourselves, it would help us have perspective on whatever we're dealing with in our life. I remember reading a book where a lady that was a nun had, was up in years and had served in that capacity for a long time, and she found herself bedridden, flat on her back, in great pain. And she struggled with that until she realized that Jesus endured the cross and suffered that pain, not only the physical pain, but the pain of taking all the sin of the world on his shoulders. And she said every morning she thought about that, and it helped her get through that day. He knew what she was going through. So Those kinds of things can help us as we think about them. But Israel finds themselves in this place, and it is their fault. Drop down to verse 29 in Numbers chapter 14. God says, your corpses will fall in this wilderness, even all of your numbered men, according to your complete number, from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Your children, however, whom you said would become a prey, I will bring them in, and they will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness. Your sons shall be set shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the wilderness. This is a railing condemnation of the unbelief of the people. And Numbers chapter 14, verse 34 is a very chilling verse. He says, according to the number of days which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition. Does anybody have a version that says that last part differently? You'll experience my alienation. Another? My rejection. Displeasure. Okay? There is a version that says, you will know that I have become your enemy. Can you imagine being at a place where you have become the enemy of God, or he is now in opposition to you? That's a tough road. And how did they get there? Whose fault was it? It was theirs. Now, I'm sure some of them said, well, it was those spies you sent over there. You know, we tend to want to blame anybody that we can other than our own sometimes. So I'm sure that they blamed the spies. I'm sure they blamed other folks. You know, there were only two people that we know could blame somebody else, right? Who were they? Caleb and Joshua. Because they encouraged the people to do otherwise. They even were almost stoned themselves because of the encouragement that they tried to give Israel to stay on the path. So Israel finds itself in the wilderness for 40 years, and it's their fault. Sometimes we need to recognize that it's our fault that we are where we are, because that's the only way that we can get out. Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 13 says, he who conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion. You know, we find the idea of repentance here. It's not just confessing that we did wrong, it's forsaking the things that we did wrong, turning away from them. So admit that I've done wrong, it was my fault, accept responsibility for it, turn from that, and do differently. So it helps to recognize that sometimes things are my own fault. The author had this quote there in the book, and he didn't say who the quote was from, but it's a pretty good one, I think. One of the annoying things about believing in free will and personal responsibility is the difficulty of finding someone to blame your problems on. And when you do find somebody, it's remarkable how often his picture turns up on your driver's license. I love that, because sometimes that is absolutely the truth. And we need to recognize that. Any thoughts at this point?
When the Israelites were trying to leave Egypt, weren't they going back to what they knew, and God wanted them to go to something better? And I just wondered, it was kind of a comparison there.
That's a really good point. Um, you know, sometimes when we get in a jam, we turn back to things we know and we've done in the past and what we're comfortable with, when God's calling us to something higher. And we fall back on bad habits when those bad habits keep us in a mess, rather than turning toward what God has in store for us. Good point. Any other comments? Can be. I agree with a whole lot of what you said. I think they glorified their life in Egypt. They forgot about the making bricks and being slaves and some of that kind of thing when they wanted to return to that. And they glorified, you know, at least we had something to eat every day and it wasn't this same stuff and all of that. And we do that in our life. Sometimes we want to turn back. Again, to the point Tim made, we want to turn back to what we know. Rather than move forward to God for what God has planned for us. All right, the second thing is, you know, we might find our place there because it was somebody else's fault. Now, you know, I sort of understand why Israel grumbled and complained all those 40 years in the wilderness. I can think of no greater misery, really, than knowing I'm wandering around with no point other than I'm going to die and my future's not very bright. Now, I say that. I also believe that that wilderness time was a time that God was calling folks to, again, be obedient to Him, trust Him, and again, we have a promised land waiting that's eternal. And they did too. And God wanted them to turn and be obedient to them. He wanted them to be His obedient children. So I believe there was that part of that wilderness journey that was supposed to happen. But a lot of people got stuck and they saw no point to it. And I imagine I'd probably be right in there with them, not seeing the point of that time, because God told me I'm going to die in the wilderness and I'm going to wander around in it until I do. That's not a bright future, is it? There were those two people, though, that were right in there with them, wandering for 40 years. And it wasn't their fault. Matter of fact, they tried to convince the people not to do it, to go ahead with God's plan because He would take care of them. And Joshua and Caleb wandered for 40 years with everybody else, and it wasn't their fault. What do we tend to do when we find ourselves in a bad situation that it wasn't our fault? We resent being there. What else? Pardon? Lash out. Okay. What else? Pay them back. Seek revenge. I want to exact my revenge because somebody put me in this spot. Typically today what we do is file a lawsuit, right? It was their fault. They did it, and I want to hold them to be accountable. The problem is that when we seek revenge, oftentimes we're the ones who die on the road, not that other person. And it's critical when things are somebody else's fault that we recognize that the only way out for us is to forgive and move forward. Somebody read, if that's still there in Numbers, read chapter 14, verse 10.
But all the congregation made stone in the stone, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation for all the children of Israel.
All right. So Joshua and Caleb, not only was it not their fault, again, as we mentioned, Israel was going to stone them because they weren't going along with them. And so they were enduring the penalty for somebody else's fault. I think about, we've had some really bad presidents at the University of Tennessee since I've been working there, 2 of them in particular, that did some bad things. And the rest of us got a whole ton of new rules, and they were gone. And, I thought, there's something wrong with this picture. They're the ones that did the bad stuff. We're still doing our job and trying to do good and all those things. And, we're bearing the penalty of their bad actions. And it happens that way sometimes. And we can't be resentful. Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 15, or in 15, says, "See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled." What's that root of bitterness? Resentment? Okay. Any other thoughts? Unforgiveness. Okay. Jealousy, a grudge, holding a grudge. The thing about holding a grudge is it makes us the prisoner, doesn't it? He tells a story about a man whose wife left him for another man, and he never could get past it. And he called them at all hours of the day or night, did all kinds of things to cause trouble, did everything he could to make sure their lives were miserable like his was. And one day he went to their home and was causing such a ruckus, she had to call the police on him, and he wound up in a jail cell himself. And it took being behind bars for him to realize he'd been in jail for a long time, just not a physical one. It was one of his own making. So sometimes we do that. I saw a hand.
I think I'll get this right. Somebody said once that hate is a prison, anger is the warden, and rage is the guard.
Well, that's great. Hate is a prison.
Anger is the warden.
Rage is the guard. That's good. So the only way out of that toward healing and restoration is forgiveness. And I know some of you have had to work through that on some things where some things happened that were somebody else's fault, but it caused great heartache. And being able to forgive through that is difficult, but part of the journey out. Risa? So there are times where Satan is the real cause behind some of these things, and we need to remember that. That was the way in the end that Israel wound up in the wilderness, right? Satan and his work on them and them failing to trust God above him. We need to remember that God's going to settle all the scores. Romans chapter 12, verse 17 through 19. Never pay back evil for evil. to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. I think he could probably do it better than anything I could dream up, don't you? And we need to let God do that and remember that he has promised to do so. Well, there's another thing that we need to keep in mind. When we grant somebody forgiveness, and we've had this conversation in a number of our classes, folks don't have to ask us to forgive them for us to forgive them. Now, there's something between them and God that is a different deal. But we can forgive without them asking forgiveness, and when we do that, we're just stepping aside and allowing God to handle the situation for us so we can concentrate on what's more important, like getting to our destination, to our home safely. And so we can't let that root of bitterness derail us from our journey. So there's something else that we ought to consider, and we've got just a few minutes to do that. Things happen, and sometimes it's nobody's fault. You know, we've just had a hurricane that destroyed Fort Myers, Florida, and has caused lots of destruction in a lot of places. Whose fault was it? Nobody's. Climate change, maybe. You know, and that could be our fault. You know, and it's important to realize sometimes we want to blame somebody else or say it's nobody's fault when it's really our fault. We've seen lawsuits lately where somebody sued fast food chains because they became obese as a result of eating that all the time. Was that the McDonald's fault? Or the coffee thing, you know, somebody bought hot coffee at McDonald's and spilled it in their lap, and they sued them because it was hot. And it resulted in the lids that say, this is hot, beware. Sometimes we want to easily shift the blame somewhere when we haven't looked closely enough at ourselves. But, there are times when it's nobody's fault, and that's tough. And this is especially one where, as people, we want to blame somebody. And who do we blame when we can't find anybody else to blame sometimes? Sometimes we blame God. Sometimes he's the easiest one to blame for us, but that may be sometimes where we jump first, but we need to be careful about that. Be careful about blaming God, and we need to stop to think instead of blaming God and imagine what life would be like if he wasn't there. And if we didn't have his word, and if we didn't have his Spirit working in us, and we didn't have the church and the support that we have there, sometimes we don't think about that. I remember one morning I was headed to Nashville and got just right backed up in a big wreck and wound up being late, and I was kind of fussing about that until I thought, I got delayed leaving the office by something, and that few minutes was the difference in me being in that wreck versus being behind it. And we know that God is working for our good, and we need to be careful about blaming God when he may be working for our good. We know he has promised to do that. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, what does it say? I know the plans I have for you. And they're plans for what? Prosper, for good, future, and a hope. And he has provided that for us. And sometimes I think we blame him because we have a short perspective instead of a long perspective. Life is short, eternity's long. And we're working towards something that is not of this earth, and it's easy to get tied down on the earth sometimes and not think long term as we ought to. Back in Hebrews chapter 12, going back to verse 11, All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight the paths for your feet, so the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. God gives us opportunities for us to see His power and His glory, and for people to see God's people working for His good. And some of those things where something happens and there's nobody to blame are opportunities for us to serve. So we need to think before we blame God. We're going to need Him to get through the difficulties that follow. And can you imagine what they look like if we blame God and shut Him out? So there are some things that we need to think about when we find ourselves in a wilderness. First of all, how do we get there? Well, it may have been my fault. It may have been somebody else's fault, or it may have been nobody's fault. And once we figure out how we got there, then we can move out. And it may require repentance on our part. It may require us forgiving someone or asking someone for forgiveness for us. Or we need to maybe step back and apologize to God for blaming Him for something that was nobody's fault, and that we need to work through and see the opportunities He gives us. So next week, we may move on to another lesson we can learn from Israel, and that is to get out of our wilderness, we need to commit strict obedience. And we'll talk about more last week. Thank you for your comments and for your participation, and I look forward to our study next week, Lord willing.